What if every single second that ticks by, every carefully counted minute that quietly dissolves into the next, was never an invention of our own making, but something far older? What if the framework we have used to measure our entire lives, the 60 seconds in a minute, the 60 minutes in an hour, and the steady progression of the stars, was already there, embedded in the very fabric of the cosmos itself, long before anyone thought to write it down? A knowledge that did not need inventing because it was woven into the light of those same stars right from the very beginning. Learned, carried, and handed down through generations by a civilization so ancient and so thoroughly forgotten that most people have never once paused to wonder where it all came from. These are not small questions, and they don't have any easy answers, because they carry the weight of something that lies much deeper, hidden just beneath the surface of things, something far more out of place than what you'd normally expect. And the trail it leaves doesn't begin with tests conducted in the last few hundred years, or any typical academic university. It begins in some of the world's most treasured museums, in fragmented artifacts made of the same sun-baked clay from which they were recovered, in the heart of ancient Mesopotamia. Artifacts left behind by a civilization so strange and so sudden that scholars are still unsettled by it, because there is a problem that has quietly disrupted historians and archaeologists alike for well over a century now. It doesn't have a dramatic name. It doesn't show up in popular documentaries as often as it should. But scholars who spend their careers studying the ancient world keep returning to it again and again because it refuses to go away. The Sumerian problem. And here's what makes it so bizarre. When we look back at most other early civilizations, we see exactly what we'd expect. Small, scattered communities, modest shelters, a slow crawl toward complexity over countless generations, one thing building upon another. Progress that is gradual, uneven, full of long pauses and false starts. That's the usual pattern. That's how it's supposed to work. But the ancient Sumerians didn't follow that pattern. Not at all. They appeared in the lowland river valleys of ancient Sumer, in a region we now call southern Iraq, not as a society still finding its footing, but as something that looked almost fully formed within hardly any time at all. Massive cities with complex administrative systems. Temples of a scale that would have required organized labor across entire regions. A fully formed writing system. A legal framework. Agricultural cultivation. Trade networks stretching far beyond their borders. All of it emerging within a window of time that, by the standards of human development, is extraordinarily narrow. And what's genuinely difficult to explain is that the Sumerians themselves insisted this knowledge didn't come from within. They said clearly and repeatedly in their own records that it was given to them, that it arrived from somewhere completely outside of themselves. So where did it come from? How did a group of people, who by every reasonable expectation should have spent centuries moving slowly from one precarious way of life to the next, rise so completely, so quickly, leaving behind such a deep impression within the earth that we are still, thousands of years later, living inside the system they built? To better understand how it all happened, we must follow the trail they left behind, because they did leave a trail, a very real and very long one, winding all the way back to the beginning of the written record as we know it, where we find clues hidden in mysterious wedge-shaped marks known as cuneiform, one of the oldest writing systems ever discovered. Pressed deeply into rectangular tablets made from the soil of the earth itself, these strange inscriptions paint vivid pictures of a truly remarkable civilization. A culture who knew that magic and reality were not separate, but merely two different sides of the same coin. Tens of thousands of these tablets have been discovered, and what they describe is a world almost nothing like our own, a time where gods still roamed the earth, not as distant figures of theology, but active presences, a time when the boundary between the sacred and the practical didn't exist, because everything was both at once, when the movements of the stars were not merely celestial events, but divine messages from above, and where the priests who read those messages held the fate of entire kingdoms in their hands. And buried inside those tablets, running quietly through the feats of engineering, and the structured grids, and the diligent record-keeping, there is something that should not have been there, something that guides it all, and lies at the very heart of tonight's exploration through the stars of antiquity. A numerical structure so precise, so internally consistent, and so perfectly suited to describing both the geometry of space and the rhythm of time, that though we have sent machines to the outermost edges of our solar system, landed human beings on the surface of the moon, and built devices that compute billions of operations every second, we still use it right now. Every time you glance at a clock and see the minutes counting up to 60, every time you look at the calendar to plan out your year, every time an engineer finds the radius of a circle or divides it into various degrees, it's there. And that's not coincidence. That structure came directly from them. But what's harder to explain is how they had it at all to begin with. They knew things they shouldn't have known. Yet there they were, people who understood and applied the mathematical principles behind the Pythagorean theorem, well over 1,000 years before Pythagoras himself was even born. The first to use a working numerical approximation for pi around 4,000 years ago, long before it had a name, and their astronomical observations, made without telescopes, without advanced instruments of any kind, was somehow accurate enough that scholars studying them today are still impressed. They didn't simply stumble into any of this. That much was clear from both what they said and what they did. It was organized, it was deliberate, it was by any fair measure a society far ahead of its time. If you are listening to this in the quiet of the night, let us know where and what time you are joining us from in the comments section below. There's something oddly comforting knowing that right now, in different corners of the world, in different time zones and different climates, countless people are all drifting slowly into the same ancient story. And if this kind of history for sleep narrative is something you find yourself returning to, consider subscribing to the channel. It goes a long way toward helping us to keep bringing these stories to you each week, and it helps other people find their way here when they're searching for somewhere quiet to land at the end of the day. If you'd like longer, uninterrupted versions to sleep to, those are available through the Legends of the Dawn membership. So close your eyes if they're heavy, and let the story come to you slowly, because this is the kind of exploration through history that asks something different of you than the kind you were taught. It doesn't always move in a straight line. It doesn't begin with a tidy date or end with a clear conclusion. It moves the way starlight moves, outward in all directions at once, reaching out for things you didn't expect, and arriving from distances that are almost impossible to fathom. Distances that can carry us all the way back to a time when mankind stood in the open air of a world blanketed in genuine darkness. And above them, the night sky would have been something that most of us have only rarely seen. A field of stars so dense and so bright that the darkness itself seemed almost secondary. They looked up into that immensity with all the devoted patience that their civilization was built on. The first ancient astronomers and high priests, the first people to look into the majesty of the night sky at those twinkling embers scattered across its vast tapestry, and question what those distant lights were, where they were going, and what deeper meaning may be hidden within their eternal light. But to glean a hint of what they saw in the darkness, we must first go back to the dawn, to their beginning as they knew it, deep in the heart of ancient Sumeria, to what may be the oldest city known to mankind, Eridu, the first city the Sumerians believed had ever existed, a very real prehistoric capital that archaeology has placed at the southern edge of ancient Mesopotamia, in the very cradle of civilization, where the land flattened into reeds and the air carried the salt of the Persian Gulf, before any measurement had been made of the night above, before any priest had pressed a stylus into wet clay to record what the moon was doing. This was where it all quietly began. The sky turned, the stars wheeled, the waters reflected that turning back at anyone who thought to look, and nobody yet had a word for what an hour was, or a season, or a year. There was only the vast, unhurried turning of everything, with no human framework laid over the top of it. That was the world before time was recorded, and it did not last for long. Something changed, something tremendous in the historical context, because nearly all of their records, dating all the way back to even the oldest Sumerian texts, speak of a morning when beings emerged from the deep, from the furthest reaches of the Apsu, the sacred subterranean freshwater source that the Sumerians believed lay beneath the earth, beneath the marshes, beneath Eridu itself. These beings rose from those southern shorelines in the forms of men wrapped in the skins of fish, half human in their appearance, and entirely otherworldly in their purpose. 7 of them, known to the Sumerians as the Apkallu, the 7 sages. And if you think that number sounds familiar, or that figures like these appear in places beyond ancient Sumer, you would be right. Variations of these 7 divine teachers sent to instruct early humanity appear in ancient Indus Valley lore, far later Babylonian and Assyrian texts, in Persian traditions, in Greece, in the Bible, in the mythology of cultures that had no obvious reason to share the same story. That kind of repetition tends to stay with you. The Apkallu were said to have been created and sent directly by Enki, the god of wisdom and water, one of the most powerful figures in the divine order of the Anunnaki gods. Enki was the one credited with breathing life and intelligence into humanity, and these 7 were his emissaries, his gift to a world that was not yet ready to organize itself. According to the texts, they came long before the Great Flood, before the city of Eridu had become what it would quickly become. They walked among the earliest kings, the ones the Sumerian king list describes as having descended from the heavens, and they taught. That is the word the sources keep returning to. They taught. Now here is where the Sumerian understanding of these events becomes genuinely interesting. The knowledge the Apkallu carried was not something they had developed on their own. It had been handed to them already fully formed, already whole, the Anunnaki, the great gods of Sumerian belief, those dwelling both in the heavens above and in the deepest recesses of our earth and oceans below, had already assembled the full set of instructions for how civilization was supposed to function. And that full set of instructions had a name. They called it the Holy May, essentially the cosmic blueprints to the universe, or at least that is the closest translation to what the Sumerians meant. What the May contained was staggering in its scope. Reading and writing, the proper conduct of kingship, the crafts of the smith and the builder, the rituals that kept the divine order intact, the rules governing how a city should be organized, how the land should be farmed, how a temple should be maintained. To a modern reader, that might sound like a collection of useful knowledge, but to the Sumerians, the May was nothing so simple as a list. It was understood to be a living force, a concentrated essence of universal order that had its own presence, its own weight. When the goddess Nanna famously obtained the May from Enki in one of the most well-known Sumerian myths, the point was not that she had acquired a simple document. She had acquired power itself. The Apkallu carried that power directly into the earliest cities of southern Mesopotamia. And what followed was not a slow, stumbling experiment in how to build a society. It arrived, by the account of the people who lived it, already assembled. The sages taught language, they taught agriculture, they taught law and ritual and the management of cities that were growing faster than anything the ancient world had ever seen before. Those achievements alone, appearing so suddenly and so complete, have puzzled historians for a long time. The gap between what came before and what ancient Sumer would soon become is genuinely difficult to explain. But the Sumerians themselves were not puzzled by it. To them, the explanation, like all answers, was already sitting in the texts. The knowledge had been given. The question of where it came from had a clear answer. And silently forming the foundations underneath it all was another gift, the one that may have outlasted every ritual, every law, every carefully maintained temple. Because with them, the Apkallu also brought numbers. Not just counting, exactly. Nothing quite as simple as it appears at first glance. Something more structured and far more deliberate. A truly advanced system, a way of organizing numerical thinking that was built around one particular numerical value as its core unit. A mathematical system that reached out from there to touch everything the Sumerians would come to be: the sky, a circle, the hour, year, and beyond. A system so precisely fitted to the rhythms of the natural world that it did not stay in ancient Mesopotamia. It traveled forward through every civilization that came after, quietly embedded in the way we still divide the minutes of every single passing moment, to this very day. That number, that system, was 60, known as the hexadecimal system. It sounds almost too simple at first, a number, just an ordinary value sitting there in the middle of Mesopotamian clay tablets, pressed into the mud by stylus and intention. But what the Apkallu were passing down wasn't arithmetic in the way we think of it now. It wasn't a tool for bookkeeping, not exactly. What they were teaching was something the ancient mind understood on a much deeper level, another kind of sacred language, a code embedded in the very structure of the world itself, just waiting for someone patient enough and quiet enough to see it. To them, this wasn't a human invention at all. It was a divine revelation, a pattern placed inside reality by the very gods who had created them, and the sages were simply the ones who had been designated to carry it, to protect it, to bring it to all of mankind, and make sure we learn to use it with the right intent. But here's what's really fascinating. They may not have been entirely wrong about that concept, because 60 isn't an arbitrary choice at all. It isn't the kind of number a culture stumbles on by accident, or picks at random because it seemed convenient. 60 is the smallest number that can be divided evenly by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. It also divides cleanly by 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. That's 12 different whole divisors, with nothing left over, no messy remainders, no fractions bleeding into the margins. In a world without decimal points, without calculators, without any of the shortcuts we now take for granted. This was extraordinary. It meant that any portion of time, any stretch of land, any arc of starlight across the sky could be cut into equal pieces, resolved into clean, whole numbers. The universe, through this lens, had no ragged edges. It came apart neatly. It fit together perfectly. To an ancient priest watching the sky from a temple roof, that kind of mathematical elegance wasn't coincidence. It was proof of an underlying intention woven into everything they were, and everything around them. And they had a way of feeling this proof in their own two hands, literally. Imagine it for a moment. A stargazer sitting in the quiet dark long before dawn has even begun to break over the horizon. The stars are still turning. The air is cool. He raises one hand and uses his thumb to press against the individual joints of his other 4 fingers. Each one has 3 joints, 4 fingers, 12 joints total. One hand becomes a counting device, cycling through 12 beats with each pass of the thumb. The other hand tracks how many full cycles have passed, using its 5 fingers as tally marks. 12 counted against 5 gives 60, a complete unit, the mathematics of the cosmos held inside a single pair of human hands, small enough to carry anywhere, precise enough to chart the movements of planets. There's something truly remarkable about that image, something that intertwines our seen and unseen reality, and grounds it to our species in a simple but profound way. The infinite expanse of the sky, measured by the smallest geometry of the human body, which brings us to the circle. And this is where it gets genuinely beautiful. If you take 6 equilateral triangles, each with interior angles of 60 degrees, and arrange them so they share a common center, they fill a perfect circle without any gap, without any overlap. 6 triangles, 6 times 60 degrees, 360 degrees total. Then ancient astronomers applied this geometry to the horizon, dividing the full arc of the sky into 12 equal sectors of 30 degrees each, a single act that gave birth to structures we still live inside every single day. The 12 divisions of the celestial horizon became the 12 months of the year, and the doubling of those 12 sectors, once for daylight and once for night, gave us the 24-hour day. Each of those hours was divided into 60 minutes, each minute into 60 seconds. Every time you glance at a clock, every time you check how long until something begins or ends, you are using a mathematical grid that was laid down in the very heart of ancient Mesopotamia, by people counting on their fingers under a sky full of gods. But the system didn't stop at seconds and hours. It scaled upward too, into ranges of time so vast they become difficult to hold in the mind. The Sumerians built nested units outward from 60, in a hierarchy of expanding scale. The gesh was 60 itself, the base unit. The ner was 600, or 10 gesh stacked together. The sa was 3,600, equal to 60 squared, and it represented the foundational unit for measuring truly enormous spans of time. With this system, the same mathematical language that measured a cup of grain could also describe the multi-thousand-year reigns of antediluvian kings, as recorded in the ancient king lists. Reigns stretching across hundreds of thousands of years, all expressed in a precise and orderly value. One system, one elegant nested structure, capable of measuring the pour of barley into a bowl, all the way up to the slow turning of entire astronomical ages, without ever switching to a different language, or a different set of rules. Before this, the night was simply immense, unbroken, a darkness with no handles to hold. But by comparing base 60 against the sky, something changed. The infinite became divisible. The overwhelming became measurable. A priest could now point to a specific degree of the horizon and say, with confidence, that a particular star would rise there on a particular night, at a particular hour, at a particular minute. The dark expanse of the universe didn't shrink, but for the first time it had a shape, it had proportion, it had rhythm. And rhythm, even on a cosmic scale, is something a human mind can rest inside of. Our consciousness is designed to find patterns. And that may have been the most important gift of all, not just calculation, but the quiet settling feeling that the sky above was ordered, that it followed rules, and that those rules could be understood, could be utilized and implemented. But the sky alone wasn't the only thing they were reaching to understand. Somewhere between the vast tsar of deep time and the brief count of a single night, they needed another layer of structure, another means of holding both the temporary and eternal together in the same frame. To do that, they would need something more than numbers alone. They would need a higher vantage point, a wider perspective from which the whole design could finally be seen. And that wider perspective, as it turned out, required something physical, something you could climb. The plains of southern Mesopotamia offered almost nothing in the way of natural elevation. No hills to speak of, just a flat, hazy expanse of river mud, stretching to every horizon, with thick morning mists rolling in off the marshlands, and a fine pale dust that hung in the air long after the wind died. If you wanted to see the sky clearly, truly clearly, you had to rise above all of that. And so, in what might be one of the most ambitious decisions in the history of early architecture, the Sumerians simply decided to build their own mountains. Not metaphorical ones, actual towering and terraced structures of sun-baked clay, rising tier by tier above the flat earth beneath them. These were the Ziggurats of antiquity, and they were not built merely for the sake of grandeur, though they were certainly grand. They were built because the sky demanded a higher place of observation, and the priests who studied that sky understood, on some level, that elevation was a form of precision. But the labor it took to get it done was staggering to consider. Workers hauled woven reed baskets filled with wet river clay, layer after layer, compressing and stacking courses of mud brick, with thick mats of bundled reeds pressed between them. Those reed layers weren't decorative. They gave the whole structure a kind of elasticity, allowing it to flex slightly with the ever-shifting waterlogged ground beneath it, rather than cracking apart from instability and the hot rays of the sun. The exterior was sealed with bitumen, that thick black pitch drawn from natural seeps in the earth, fragrant and slightly acrid in the summer warmth, creating a surface that was both waterproof and unmistakably of this place in this particular corner of the ancient world. It smelled of the earth it rose from, even as it reached upward towards something far beyond it. These structures spread far and wide across the Mesopotamian plain, with a kind of quiet inevitability. Wherever a Sumerian city took root, a ziggurat eventually followed. The knowledge of how to build them, how to align them, and how to use them traveled through the temple schools known as the Edubba, which translates roughly as House of Tablets. These were the scribal and priestly academies, institutions of a lost age, where young men learned mathematics, astronomy, ritual, and the management of time itself. They spread from the ancient temple at Eridu, which had been dedicated to Enki, and considered by the Sumerians to be the oldest sacred site in the world, all the way to the famous White Temple rising over Uruk after the flood, and all the while the Edubba carried the tradition forward, each new generation of priests inheriting both the buildings and the knowledge of what to do with them. What the builders of those temples did, first and most critically, was orient them, because before a single foundational brick was laid, surveyors had already spent considerable effort aligning the structure itself to align with the four cardinal directions. And they did it with a precision that still draws curious comments from modern researchers. They accomplished this using tools of almost disarming simplicity. A straight wooden pole driven into the ground, called a gnomon, would cast a shadow throughout the day, and by carefully marking where that shadow pointed at specific moments, a surveyor could establish a true north-south line. At night, they tracked circumpolar stars, those that never dip below the horizon, watching their slow rotation around the celestial pole, and using that movement to check and refine their alignments. Those finished monuments, some of the largest structures of the ancient world, were anchored to the geometry of the earth itself through nothing more than careful observation and patient calculation. That alignment was not incidental. It was the whole point. As the seasons turned and the months passed, the shadows cast by the Ziggurats' sharp-stepped edges swept across the broad lower terraces with a slow, measurable regularity. The angle of the shadow at dawn on a specific morning told the watching priest something specific and actionable. The sun clearing the eastern corner at a particular angle meant the spring equinox had arrived. A shadow of a certain length at midday meant the solstice was approaching. The building itself was functioning as a calendar, a massive, immovable instrument for reading the year. And the communities living in its shadow, farmers planning their planting, merchants timing their journeys, officials scheduling festivals and offerings, all of them relied on this information. The ziggurat was doing, in stone and shadow, what the clay tablets were doing in cuneiform. It was holding time in a form that could be read, could be touched, and felt and observed by all. And at the very top of these structures, in the most revered placement, sat the highest sanctuary. It was often plastered smooth with white gypsum, and on a clear night it caught the silver light of the moon in a way that made it visible from a considerable distance across the plains. At dawn, the first pale gold of sunrise would touch it before reaching anything else in the city below. This elevated chamber was understood as a meeting place, a threshold where the divine could descend and mortals could, if only briefly, connect with the spiritual realm. The priests known as the Baru gathered there, wrapped in heavy wool against the night chill, watching the sky with a practiced and unhurried attention. Below them, the scent of cedar incense drifted upward from the lower terraces, mixing with the dry smell of sun-warmed brick with the faint, resinous tang of bitumen sealing the outer walls. It was a sensory world set deliberately apart from the noise and the dust and the bustling of the city below, a place where the distinction between the practical and the sacred simply dissolved, because in the Sumerian understanding of things, there had never really been a distinction to begin with. The stars moved according to divine will. The calendar reflected that movement, and the ziggurat, standing at the center of the city, was the instrument that translated one into the other, creating a sacred, timeless sanctuary cradled between the soil of the earth below and the stars above. And from those massive structures, we get a glimpse of how these ancient stargazers transformed the raw observations taken from the peaks of their towering temples into the world's first formal calendar. Think about what that actually means for a moment. Not a rough sense of the seasons, not a general feeling that winter was coming. A structured, deliberate system for measuring time, built from nothing but careful eyes patient minds, and the slow turning of the sky overhead. It began at dusk on the highest terraces of the great temple houses. As the last light of the sun drained out of the western horizon, priests and trained observers would take their positions and wait. They were watching for something they called the inbu, the first faint waxing curve that comes after a new moon. That delicate silver sliver that appears for just a short window of time, low in the sky, easy to miss if you weren't looking. And when it appeared over that distant horizon, it wasn't just a celestial event, it was a signal. Ram's horns sounded from the high terraces, and the sound rolled down through the city streets below. A new month had begun. Nanna, the moon god, had shown his face, and life in the city reorganized itself accordingly. Merchants updated their records. Temple officials adjusted their schedules. Farmers marked another cycle on their mental ledgers, all of it triggered by that single, quiet sliver of waxing crescent moonlight. This kind of vigil happened every month, without interruption, and over time, those observations accumulated into something more precise. Ancient astronomers came to understand that the moon completed its full cycle from new to full and back again in roughly 29.5 days. You can't have half a day in a calendar, so they did what any careful mind would do. They alternated. One month would be 29 days, the next would be 30, then 29 again. 12 of those months strung together gave them a year of 354 days. And for a while, that was enough. Every phase of the moon served as a visible shared clock face, stretched across the night sky. The rise of the new moon meant the start of a new month. The swelling half-disk meant the month was deepening. The full moon overhead meant they were at the midpoint, when every farmer in the fields, every shepherd watching a flock on the open plains, could look up and know exactly where they stood in time. There was something quietly reassuring about that. The sky itself was the calendar. No one had to carry anything, or remember anything complicated. The information was simply always there, overhead, written in the very light streaming down from the heavens above. But there was one problem remaining, the kind of problem that didn't announce itself all at once. The lunar year of 354 days was 11 days shorter than the solar year of 365. That gap doesn't sound like much. But let it run uncorrected for a few years, and the calendar starts to drift. Harvest festivals begin landing in the wrong season. The planting ceremonies that were supposed to align with the floods of the Tigris and Euphrates start slipping earlier and earlier, year by year. Within a generation, the sacred calendar and the actual agricultural reality would be completely out of step. This was not an abstract concern. For a civilization that depended on the land, a misaligned calendar was a serious threat. So the stargazers watched for something else. Certain stars, certain clusters. When they appeared on the eastern horizon just before sunrise, and after a period of invisibility, they served as reliable markers of where the solar year actually stood. And the star cluster known as mul.apin, which we call the Pleiades today, was one of the most important of these. When its heliacal rising didn't match where the calendar said it should be, that was the signal. The sun and moon had drifted out of alignment again. And when that happened, the king would issue a royal decree adding a 13th month to the year. They called it the Dirig, a leap month inserted to bring the lunar calendar back into harmony with the solar one. The decision wasn't arbitrary. It came from sustained observation. From comparing what the sky was actually doing with what the calendar predicted it should be doing, and then correcting the difference between. That's a form of scientific thinking, even if it was wrapped in the mythological language of gods and divine will. This lunisolar calendar governed almost every corner of Mesopotamian life. The spring equinox marked the Apkallu, the sacred New Year festival, which coincided with the swelling of the great rivers, the flooding of the dark river silt onto the fields, and the beginning of planting season. Time wasn't something that simply happened to people without context. It was something that could be understood, tracked, and worked with. A sacred rhythm that guaranteed the fields would flood again, and the grain would grow again, and the world would continue turning in the way it always had. And the record-keeping that held all of this together was considered sacred and holy work, so sacred that even the gods themselves were said to aid in this task. Because somewhere in those vast plains it is said that the Lady Nisaba, the goddess of grain and writing, and the reading of stars, presided over a temple in an ancient city they called Eresh, a place whose exact location has been swallowed by time and sand. But the name of that temple is still known. It was called mul.apin, the House of Stars. There, under her divine patronage, scribes maintained detailed lunar tables, tracking monthly observations and compiling official calendar decrees that were then sent out to distant cities all across the empire. From the marshlands of Eridu near the sparkling southern seas to the vast open plains of the north, every community received the same calculations, the same corrections, the same shared measure of time. The calendar wasn't just a small local tool. It was the thread that connected their entire civilization to a single, synchronized understanding of exactly what place in time they held in the great turning of the cosmos. And with that revelation, it became something more than a counting of days. Time itself became a shared pulse, felt from one end of the land to the other. A quiet agreement between every city, every temple, every farmer watching the horizon for the right moment to plant his seeds. And through all of it, from the very first moment mankind took its first breath, to the many Sars that spanned the antediluvian kingdom, it all started with curious people simply standing in the dark, looking up. Hold that picture in your mind for just a moment. Let the darkening silhouette of ancient Mesopotamia materialize before your eyes, like a half-remembered dream, rising steadily out of the fog of deep antiquity. Vast rolling plains nearing the middle of the night, grasslands and deserts and marshlands spreading from the southern shores to the northernmost reaches to the tall jagged mountains in the east. A landscape that came 3,000 years before anything we'd recognize, stretching out in every direction. Flat, immense, absolutely silent in the way that only very old places can be, and rising out of that flatness, tall platforms, artificial mountains of hard-baked clay, whitewashed and pale, catching the last breath of the setting sun before the stars take over entirely. This is where the watching began. Not in libraries, not in lecture halls. Up here, on the highest point anyone could see for miles, where a person could stand and feel the full weight of the sky pressing down upon their shoulders, yet somehow lifting their spirits upward all the same. From that height, ancient Sumer looked nothing like what most people imagine when they think of early civilization. Looking down from those high terraces, the astronomers would have seen a world full of life and color, even at the edge of night. Date palm groves stretched out below in long, rustling rows, their fronds catching the last of the evening wind. Emerald marshlands spread wide to the south, threaded through with still water and the sounds of rustling reeds and native birds settling into their nesting places. Fields ran in every direction, broken up by the clean geometric lines of irrigation canals that carried the river's water further inland, turning what should have been dust into something that could feed an empire. The air coming up from all of it was cool and a little damp, carrying the smell of river silt and blooming nocturnal flowers and the faint sweetness of orchards somewhere below in the dark. It was not a barren world, it was a breathing one. And then there was the sky above it, which on a clear Mesopotamian night would stop almost anyone cold. The stars over the flat river plain are not the stars most of us see now, dimmed by city light and haze. They were everywhere, dense and brilliant, and arranged in patterns so consistent that you could slowly begin to trust them, to feel in them something that resembled order. And even more spectacular was their bright image translated into the rivers below, in the cool waters of the Euphrates and the Tigris, and the wide glassy surfaces of the surrounding marsh lagoons, which caught the light of the midnight sky and held it like a mirror, a reflection so still and so complete that the stars above and their likenesses below became almost indistinguishable. Standing on the high terrace, a person could look out and see the horizon dissolve, sky merging with water until the platform itself seemed to float, suspended in the middle of something endless and dark and scattered with silver light. The boundary between up and down stopped being obvious, no mere metaphor to the people who stood there to witness it. It was what they actually saw. It was the condition they worked in, and they had designated a specific group of people to immerse themselves in it, the ones doing the watching, and the recording, and the observing. They had a collective name and a sacred role. They were the Baru, a class of priest astronomers whose responsibilities were deeply revered. As twilight faded, and the city below settled into its nighttime quiet, the Baru would climb the whitewashed staircases of the Ziggurat in their dark and heavy wool cloaks, stepping carefully, taking their time. There was no hurry in this work. Hurry would have defeated the purpose entirely. And upon reaching the highest open-air terrace, they entered something that looked very much like a deep state of meditation, of cognitive flow, standing still, allowing their eyes to adjust to the shadows, and letting the world below them simply slip away until only the sky remained. The city was sleeping. The palm trees were dark shapes against a darker horizon, and up here, alone with the stars, the Baru kept silent watch. The instruments they carried were simple in their materials, but careful in their design. Straight rods of polished wood or hollow reed served as sighting tools. They would be held up at arm's length to track the precise angle of a rising star. Copper rings were formed into careful circles, helping to align their gaze with consistency, night after night. And on the terrace itself, shallow clay basins filled with still water created an artificial horizon that was perfectly level, evened out in a way that the land below never quite could be. By watching the exact moment a star's reflection touched the surface of the water, the Baru could translate the movement of the sky into something repeatable, something measurable, something that could be written down and checked against the night before, and the night before that. The geometry was not complicated in its tools, but it was exact in its intention. To these observers, the reading of the sky had a name and a nature. They called it the Shattir Samami, which carried a meaning that translates to something like the writing of the heavens. Every constellation slowly drifting across the deep dark tapestry, every planet holding its steady course among the fixed stars, every faint point of light that appeared and vanished with the seasons, All of it was understood as a language of its own. The gods had written omens into those shifting celestial seas, and the Baru were the ones trained to decipher it, to read it, to give it meaning that could be understood. This was not just a meaningless exercise meant to comfort a population who didn't know any better. It was understanding far beyond them. It was an act of reverence carried out in complete stillness, by devoted minds positing themselves to reach into the upper realms, watching the stars above reflect their image below, and the quiet feeling that the cosmos, in all its vast turning and returning, was something that they could be one with. And so, every day when the bustle of the cities slowly came to rest, the Buru kept vigil, but only after the sun descended behind the western marshlands in the way it does in flat river country, where there are no hills to interrupt it, where the horizon simply opens wide and receives the fading light like a slow exhale. The sky above Eridu shifted from amber to something deeper, a wash of indigo spreading from the east, while the west still held faint traces of rose and copper. Hearth fires began to glow in the clay courtyards below, small and warm, casting long soft shadows across the avenues between the buildings. The city did not go dark so much as it simply changed its quality of light. A quieter light, a gentler one, the kind that asks nothing of you but to feel your mind relax in its soft embrace. Inside the tablet houses, the last of the scribes set down their reed styluses for the night. There was no ceremony to it, just the small, familiar sound of a tool placed against a mat, and then stillness. The clay tablets rested in their long rows, freshly inscribed, slowly curing in the night air. And the numbers pressed into them, the star positions, the careful markings of lunar cycles, all of it lay quietly inside the earth they were made from, held safe. The knowledge was not going anywhere. It would still be there in the morning, and the morning after that, and for thousands of years beyond any single night. Step outside the tablet houses, and the landscape offered its own kind of quiet conversation. The Euphrates moved slowly in the darkness, catching faint starlight along its surface. The tall reeds along the banks shifted in the night breeze, a low and steady sound, less like rustling and more like breathing. The canal water lapped at the muddy banks in a rhythm so slow and so consistent that it became something you stopped noticing after a while, something that simply folded into the background of the night, like a heartbeat you forget is yours. The air still carried the scent of sun-kissed clay that had been baking all day, and was now releasing that warmth slowly back into the night. Cedar resin still drifted down from the high altars of the Ziggurats, faint and sweet, mixing with river silt and the green smell of the marshlands stretching out in every direction. Those ancient cities resided inside something larger than themselves now. That was the difference. Before the careful work of those astronomers and scribes, the night had simply been the night, vast and unmeasured, generous with its stars, but offering no clear structure, no sense of reassurance. Now the darkness had a shape to it. The hours had names. The moon's position had meaning that could be written down, compared, and predicted. The cosmos still turned as it always had, but now there were people below who understood its rhythm well enough to move with it, rather than staying stagnant and uncertain. And that understanding did not make the sky smaller. If anything, it made the night feel safer, orderly, like a silent, unanimous agreement between the heavens above and the earth below. The stars that crossed over the skies of Eridu that night are the same stars crossing the sky right now. a realization that tends to arrive quietly, without announcement, but it lands somewhere deep when it does. Knowing that the very first ancient astronomers to look up at the sparkling tapestry turning overhead had found the same image that anyone looking up tonight will find. The constellations they named, the cycles they tracked, the numbers they pressed into clay, all of it is still running, still turning, still marking the hours in the same patient way it always has. The cosmos does not hurry. It never has. And there is something in that, something settling about the sheer permanence of it all. Thoughts have a way of loosening at this hour. Barriers that felt solid earlier in the day begin to soften at the edges, the way mist rises from still water in the early morning, and simply disappears into the air without any particular effort. The conscious mind, when it finally allows itself to let go, drifts somewhere quieter than thought, somewhere outside of any tangible realm and into the language of the universe itself. And all the while, the stars remain overhead, steady and unhurried, just as they were to the first people who ever thought to watch them with care. And the night holds everything gently, the way it always has, the way it always will.